What does D&D mean to you? It's a question I've been asking a lot of people recently, and heck, I've been asking myself that quite a lot as well. D&D, of course, means Dungeons and Dragons, but that's, of course, just the scratch surface. What does D&D actually mean? As you can tell here, I put up a poll semi-recently, a month ago, about what D&D actually means. And of course, I could only fit four semi-little sentences there, and then I put a little something else there. But I can see here that of all the people that voted, we have a decent amount of people who think it's a role playing as characters in all sorts of scenarios. But we, of course, get different answers as well. And the comment section's loaded up with a whole bunch of various things as well. So D&D right there means something different, which is interesting. When you think of other games, such as, let's say, Call of Duty, you know that Call of Duty means to you a shooting game. But you could ask someone else, oh, Call of Duty means a fun way to hang out with my friends. Or it could mean, oh, it's a fun single player adventure because I don't play any of the multiplayer. Oh, it's the battle royale aspect, etc., etc. So we're seeing that these things that used to be simple answers are no longer becoming simple. And why is that important? It's important because everybody's showing up to the table with different expectations. And while you might think D&D means one thing, someone else is going to have an entirely different opinion. Recently, I did a podcast with a whole bunch of other awesome people, and one of the questions I asked all these people was, do dice matter in your game? Do dice dictate the game? And some people said, yeah, absolutely. Dice are intrinsic to the game. Dice are what makes the game. And I had someone else say, oh, I imagine in the future there's going to be no dice in D&D. What does that mean? What is it going to look like? What is a D&D without dice? Well, I mean, quite frankly, we have D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, and I know plenty of people run games of D&D where you don't go into dungeons, and I know plenty of people run games where you don't fight dragons. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that the game is going to change over time, because that's just what happens. Over the course of now 50 years, D&D has had a large cultural change. So I wanted to ask these questions here. Is it math? Is D&D at its core a game about rolling shiny math rocks and combining them all and seeing what the result is? Is math what makes D&D? Can you have D&D without math? I personally can say that from personal experience, yes, you can have a D&D like experience, but of course, what I perceive as D&D is going to be different from what other people perceive as D&D. I've had many a session where no dice have been thrown because we were too busy role playing, and if anything that were ever to be a dice roll came up, it was so blatantly obvious that the player characters were either going to automatically succeed or automatically fail. There was no need to roll dice. So, is it math? I think it can be. I know a lot of people run math heavy games, and I know a lot of people actually are running math light games, right? Because that's just the way we have changed our perceptions of what D&D is. Role play versus role play. Do we create characters that are super intrinsic and detailed and fleshed out, and we role play those out super hardcore? We put ourselves in the mindset of these characters and we go hard on the paint? Or do we have a couple of little taglines there on our character sheet, our ideal bonds, flaws, and motivations, and we roll to see what our character does? I mean, that's the thing. I have played it both ways, and I like it both ways. It really depends. I have played games where I have rolled up the character right from the beginning, and boom, there, I've got it. I've got this character in my mind, and I know I'm going to play them a certain way. If this certain scenario comes up, they're going to certainly act this way. And then I've had other times where my character is sort of just acting off the cuff and is acting completely, reactionary to the world. And I'm okay with that as well. I know a lot of people perceive role play versus role play as different, as strange, and I don't know if the two mix. I don't know if you can have one person in the party be a role player and then one person just rolling dice and seeing how they act. I don't know if that meshes well. I haven't personally seen it, but I'd be curious to see what you have to say about that. Lore and canon. Is D&D all about the lore? Is it all about the canon? Obviously, right now in 5e, it's all about the Forgotten Realms, and specifically, it's about the Sword Coast. But D&D's history is incredibly rich with tons of awesome, unique campaign settings, whether that be entirely different worlds, and even if it is in the Forgotten Realms, there is plenty of places outside of the Sword Coast. Does D&D actually need to take place in these? Or, as of course we've seen a lot of people do, is it D&D if you are running a homebrew world, your homebrew setting? Well, I certainly think so, because what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? D&D started off from nothing, and wouldn't you know, people decided to pick up their papers and all of a sudden create a world much like the people did back in the day with Blackmoor and with Greyhawk and all of those places. People make their own adventure locations, people make their own lore, people make their own canon. And I think that is intrinsic to D&D, is the fact that you can either be playing in the rich established worlds that they've created over the course of time, or you could be running your own things, but it doesn't matter because it's the system, not the setting, that makes D&D. Now, how many ways are there to play D&D? I have seen people say that you are playing D&D wrong, which for me is interesting. How do you play D&D, right? Do you have to play D&D a certain way? You can only do certain actions. Do you have to follow these strict rules? Does it have to be located in a certain scenario? What does playing D&D mean if you can play it right or play it wrong? In my own personal opinion, you can definitely play D&D wrong, but that's not more so running it a certain way. It's more being mean and being gatekeepy and all that. I think that's how you play D&D wrong. Playing D&D, for me in particular, means that you are sitting down around the table and using this system, and no matter how much you homebrew it, as long as the core of it is D&D, then you are playing D&D, and that's the end of the story. But I know there's so many people out there that will say, oh, you are role-playing too much. Oh, you're not rolling enough dice. Oh, you're not going into dungeons. You're not fighting dragons. All these things. I know there's people out there that are saying that you're playing D&D right or wrong. And my question for you all is there a right way to play D&D? Is there a wrong way to play D&D? Does playing D&D wrong mean that you're not playing D&D at all? I think that's entirely subjective, but maybe it's not. In fifth here is why the hate. D&D, of course, is just referring to Dungeons and Dragons, but something unique about Dungeons and Dragons is the additions of D&D. When you take a look at something like Call of Cthulhu, the first edition of Call of Cthulhu versus the 7th edition of Call of Cthulhu, it's the same game. It's just that they clean up the math a little bit. But when you look at D&D, whether that be OD&D, AD&D, 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, all of these different variations of D&D are intrinsically different games, right? Whether that be they add more mechanics, or they change what the stats actually mean, or da-da-da, this and that. D&D has been a different game time and time again. So, my question for all is, why is there hate? And why is there fear? I see a lot of people that are new to D&D, specifically because they came in with 5th edition, and they shun the old ways. They are afraid of the OSR. They don't like the OSR. And at the same time, I see a lot of people that are from the older school of thinking, and they do not like the newer things. They do not like 5th edition. Why is there all this hate? Why is there all this fear? Why is there all this grievance against people playing the D&D game, but just a different edition from you? I certainly think that divisive nature of D&D is unfortunate. It does not need to exist. I think we both can be playing our own games, and as long as you're not combating one another, it's perfectly fine. And that's, in fact, how you get people into your style of play. If you want people to play old school play, then you invite them with honey, not with vitriol and hate. And at the same time, if you are trying to run 5th edition because you like that, then getting people to play in your system is just all about coaxing them with sweet words, not saying that they are stuck in their ways. At the end of the day, there might be a textbook definition of D&D, as mentioned here, There might be a D&D absolutely means this, and there is no ifs, ands, or buts. But me personally, I do not believe in that, and I don't think a lot of people believe in that. I think D&D means so many different things to so many different people, and it's so subjective that there is no one right way to both run, play, observe, and whatever else of D&D. D&D has been a staple of tabletop role-playing games coming up on 50 years now, and I think that it will never go away. Whether that be in the form of the old school coming back, whether that be in the new form kicking off, whatever the case may be, it will be in the top rings of tabletop role playing games. And the fact that there's so much subjectivity to it and it's so accepted by so many people is absolutely astounding, and that's awesome. So my question for you all is this: what does D&D mean to you? Does D&D mean exactly one thing? Does it mean a lot of things? Is it something that you can actually type in comments, or is it something so abstract that there's just no way you could actually type it out because typing words alone would not be enough to articulate what you're trying to say? Do you think there is a right way to play D&D? Do you think there's a wrong way to play D&D? And do you think D&D will be a staple of the tabletop role-playing game community in the next 50 years? Go ahead and tell me those things because I would love to hear it. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. And thank you to my amazing patrons. You guys are absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much. And I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.